Hi, this week we're looking at the central nervous system. Keep in mind that the central nervous system falls in line with the exoskeleton. So when we're looking at the central nervous system, we're talking about the brain located in the head, not a very good drawer, and your spinal cord, which goes down this way. Okay, so your brain and your spinal cord are going to be part of the central nervous system. The rest of the nervous system will be what is called the peripheral nervous system, and we'll be looking at that in the next set of lecture slides. So for the central nervous system, the important stuff to keep in mind is that it's composed of the brain and spinal cord that together are going to coordinate all the information and all the function for the nervous system. Okay, this is the coordination and integration center of the central nervous system. Okay. The central nervous system will also be composed of what's called gray matter and something called white matter. Okay, these are the two types of nervous tissue that you're going to find in the central nervous system. Gray matter contains the cell bodies, while the non-myelinated fibers, so those that do not have myelin sheath, are going to be contained within the gray matter. White matter contains all of the myelinated axons, those that have a myelin sheath. And the brain and the spinal cord kind of run backwards to each other with regards to the white and gray matter. So in the brain, you're going to see how you have white matter here located in the middle, right? This is all white matter located in the middle of the brain, so deep in the brain, while the gray matter is located towards the exterior. This is the opposite of the spinal cord. So here we're looking at the brain. Here we're looking at a spinal cord. And in the spinal cord, you can see how it forms a nice, beautiful butterfly pattern here. It's just a gorgeous butterfly pattern that is formed in the spinal cord. But the pattern inside, so deep in the spinal cord, is going to be the gray matter, while the whole exterior is white. So again, you have gray contains within white in the spinal cord, white contains within gray in the brain. So it does the opposite. And if you remember from your intro to the nervous system, the myelin sheath is going to serve to increase the speed of nerve impulses while at the same time insulating those nerves. It's also going to allow those nerves, in part, depending on the level of damage, to do regeneration. This is not the case for all nerves within the nervous system. A good example of what happens when the myelin sheath breaks down is your multiple sclerosis. You've all probably heard of MS, especially with regards to the commercials and the constant MS pills that are showing up out there. But multiple sclerosis is a pretty serious problem because what's happening is this is a degenerative neurological disease in which you have the very slow breakdown of myelin. So wherever you have myelin, in the brain, in the spinal cord, and in your nerves, you have a slow breakdown of that myelin, especially in the central nervous system. And as you know, if myelin increases the speed of impulses and helps with regeneration and also helps with your insulation, then if you're losing your myelin, those nerve impulses are going to be very, very slow. And they're not going to be as insulated, which means you might tend to lose some of that action potential or some of that impulse. And so what happens with somebody with multiple sclerosis as a degenerative disease is that they start to have a loss of a fast function. It can cause some types of shaking. It can cause paralysis in certain parts of the body. It can cause for certain parts of the body to suddenly start to feel kind of numb or not function as fast as they can. And so this is a very slow breakdown that takes time to occur. Okay, moving along. So again, the central nervous system is going to be composed of both the brain and the spinal cord. We're going to look first at the brain and then look at the spinal cord. The brain, which I absolutely love, I think it's super cute. So your brain is composed of, you can separate the brain into different ways But your brain is basically bilateral, which means that it has the same on both sides. So this is your brain, okay? And you can actually separate the brain into two pieces, your right and left hemisphere. And this is very important because those two hemispheres are going to have somewhat separate functions, and they're going to control the opposite side of the brain. So the right hemisphere controls the left side of the body. The left side of the brain controls the right side of the body. Okay. On top of that, you can also divide the brain into four major areas or four major divisions. This whole main part that you're seeing here is called your cerebrum. Within the cerebrum, and we'll see, because if you were to split the brain apart, right, do a mid-sagittal cut on the brain, what you're going to see inside the brain is the following. And it looks like this. And so this whole large part here being your cerebrum, this middle part here, or located here, being your diencephalon. Then you're going to have this whole long structure here, from here down, which is going to be your brainstem. And then the little guy, this little bump at the back, is your cerebellum. Okay. That little guy is the cerebellum. And you can see how each of these major divisions of the brain is going to be in charge of something different. The cerebrum is basically your higher mental functions. So things like memory, language, speech, coordination of movement, all of that's going to be taken care of within your cerebrum. So this is the biggest part of the brain, and it's going to control those functions. Your diencephalon, that middle part there, is actually going to be in charge of other things. Here's where you're going to have your thalamus and your hypothalamus, which are the big bosses. So they're going to be in charge of maintaining homeostasis throughout the body. They're going to regulate biological rhythms, process, and integrate information. Your brainstem is going to be the guy in charge of maintaining that homeostasis. So the diencephalon says what to do pretty much, and the brainstem is in charge of maintaining homeostasis, making sure that the breathing and the rhythm and the pulse are all kept continuous. Okay. And we'll look in more detail at what each one of these do. And that back one, the cerebellum, this is a guy who is involved in monitoring and coordinating movement. This is the guy who gets affected when anybody drinks too much alcohol, and then you start to get a buzz, and that buzz causes you to kind of be a little bit slower maybe, and not be able to coordinate your movements correctly. Get it? Coordinate movements, because it coordinates your movements. And then you start to get tipsy and kind of stumble and wobble and try to grab something and your hand just goes off to the side. That's because this is the area that's directly impacted by the consumption of alcohol. Okay, so looking in a little bit more detail at each of the divisions, the major one, that's cerebrum. So this whole major portion of the brain can be separated into the two sides, the left side and the right side, or what are called your lateral hemispheres. It can also be divided into five cerebral lobes, and those should be easy to find because they follow along with the bones of the skull. So if you remember the bones of the skull, you had your frontal, your parietals, your occipitals, and then your temporals. It's the same thing with the lobes. You have your frontal lobe, your parietal lobe, your temporal lobe, and your occipital lobe. And you're going to have the same on both sides. Then you're going to have the four hollow chambers, which are your ventricles. These guys are important because your ventricles are the spaces through which your cerebrospinal fluid can pass. And we're going to talk about that in a moment. And then, of course, we already talked about some of those major functions, those higher mental functions that the cerebrum has. There is a fifth cerebral lobe called the insula, but don't worry about that one. We're not going to do much with that one here in this class. All right, and so here you can see again this area here, this whole big area is your cerebrum, this is your cerebellum, this is your brainstem, and the diencephalon is located inside there. When you do a mid-sagittal cut, that's when you can see the diencephalon. All right, each hemisphere, as I mentioned before, if you divide the brain into half, you have the left side and the right side. Those are known as your hemispheres. And each hemisphere controls the opposite side of the body. This is what's called crossing over. And that crossing over for the control occurs in the brainstem and the spinal cord. So your left brain will send a message down through the brain, through the brainstem, and when it reaches the brainstem, lower part of the brainstem and the spinal cord, that's when it's going to switch to the right side of the body and vice versa. So information coming in and information exiting from the left side of the body will always go to the right side of the brain, and information going or coming to the right side of the brain, to the right side of the body, will always go to the left side of the brain. Okay, this is important to know because of damage and strokes. You can think about when a person comes into the hospital and they start talking, or their person that's with them starts talking about what they saw happen to their loved one. Then that one of the first things that the neurologist is going to do is, if they suspect it might be a stroke, they ask them to smile, because when you smile, you are involving a lot of nerves in your face that are coordinated by the brain, but they're going to be coordinated by the opposite side of the brain. So if you had a stroke, which is a brain bleed, in the right side of the brain, and it's affecting that side of the brain, then what might happen is when the person goes to smile, they can't move the left side of their face. So they're going to be smiling only with one side of the face. And that way, the neurologist is ready to pinpoint it down to, it looks like there was a bleeding, there might be some damage to the opposite side of the brain. And they can already start to narrow down what they need to look at. Lateralization is what is referred to when we're talking about dominance of one side over the other. You've probably all heard about this, whether you're more left side of the brain or right side of the brain. Okay, it's not really that exact, but the left side of the brain is the side of the brain that's going to be more in charge of things like language and complex intellectual functions, while the right side of the brain is going to be more in charge of the stuff that's nonverbal. So while the left side is in charge of thinking and constructing sentences and words and phrases, your right side is going to be more about visual spatial skills, thoughts, artistic skills, etc. Okay, these are all important things to know. You can expect questions about this in your multiple choices questions. Your cerebrum is going to be composed of gray matter, of course, in the outermost regions, white matter in the innermost regions, because we already mentioned the brain and the spinal cord are backwards with regards to the gray and the white matter. And I'm not going to go over that again because we already had talked about that. This is a cool visual for showing you where some of those areas are. You already know that the cerebrum is in charge of higher mental functions, but it's not equal all through the cerebrum. We already see that the right side of the brain is more artistic, the left side of the brain is more language-based and interpretive things. So you also have the same going throughout the cerebrum. So you can see here, for instance, is your primary visual cortex. Over here is where you have your auditory association, your prefrontal cortex, and it has all of these things. Don't worry, I'm not going to quiz you about these different regions, or these, I should say, these different functional areas of the cerebrum. I just want you to understand that the cerebrum does have higher mental functions. Know a handful of what some of those mental functions are, but you don't need to know the exact spaces where those higher mental functions are located. If you were to choose to go into specifics in your individual programs as to working, say, with neuroscience, then you would have to know these higher mental functions areas. And this is just another one showing you a little bit of how the gray and white matter is located within the cerebrum and what it looks like if you were to do a cut, so a transverse cut on the brain and you're looking at it from an inferior view. This one's a good one for showing you the left side and the right side of the brain and what they coordinate. Remember that they're going to coordinate the opposite side of the body. All right. The cerebellum, which is that little guy that's hanging off the back of the brain, he's also known as your little brain. He has the folds very similar to how the brain looks with its many little folds. By the way, I forgot to mention to you one little thing with regards to these folds. When you see these folds, this increases surface area, and the dips in the folds are called sulcus or sulci, plural. And the high elevations in these folds are called your gyrus or gyri. Okay, the cerebellum is similar, and that's going to have a lot of little folds. It's going to contain about 50% of the brain's neurons, which is a lot. And it's going to have so like the rest of the brain, it's gray on the outside, white on the inside. But the cool thing about the white inside the cerebellum is it creates something that looks like a branching out of a tree. It's really very pretty, and you can see it here. You can see how these white structures go out like this, almost like if you were looking at a tree. It's very beautiful. So it's actually called Arbor Vitae, which is Latin for tree of life. It's very, very beautiful. So the white matter of your cerebellum is the tree of life, Arbor Vitae. Right. As we talked about, the cerebellum is going to be charged of coordinating skeletal muscle movements, and it's the area that's going to be affected when you consume too much alcohol, with many types of drugs, trauma, or stroke can cause damage there. It's going to be important for language and sequencing as well. Okay, the diencephalon and brainstem, these are the next two parts. The diencephalon is this area located right here. What you're seeing right above the diencephalon, let me explain really quickly. I'm going to outline this guy here. This guy right here that I'm outlining is your corpus callosum. Okay, the corpus callosum actually separates the left side and the right side of the brain. And if you were looking at a model of the brain, you will be able to see it very easily here. So you can see the corpus callosum. It's very visible. When you do your brain dissections, you're also going to be able to see that differentiation. And so the corpus callosum separates the left side and the right side of the brain. And it's also located between the cerebrum and your diencephalon. So your diencephalon is this area located underneath the corpus callosum. And this is the area that's going to be pretty much the boss, okay? It's going to be in charge of coordinating and relaying information for pretty much everything that has to be done in the body. So the thalamus relays and processes sensory information, while the hypothalamus controls all your autonomic functions. So things like breathing, blood pressure, digestion, respiration, all of that is going to be controlled by your autonomic functions. And then your epithalamus is going to include your pineal body and choroid plexus. Your pineal body is, for instance, the guy who's going to be in charge of maintaining your circadian rhythm, so your ability to fall asleep at night. Pretty important. It's also going to contain your optic chiasma. So when we're looking at our cranial nerves, the optic chiasma is the area from which exits the optic nerves, which are the ones that run to the eye. And we're going to look at the optic nerve in more detail when we get into the special senses. You're also going to have your posterior pituitary glands. Your pituitary glands we will look at a lot in 169 when you look at the endocrine system. And then you're going to have your limbic system and your mammillary bodies. Sorry. These are responsible for memories. So you have in your diencephalon a lot of useful, needed parts for memorization. The last part of the brain is going to be that brain stem. So if you're thinking about the brain, cerebellum, you've got your diencephalon, and then this whole thing that's coming down is your brainstem. That's your cerebellum over there. And so that brainstem is actually going to be a bundle of nerve fibers and nuclei that are going to connect between the cerebrum and the spinal cord. Okay. It also uses information provided to it from the diencephalon. So if you remember, the diencephalon, as we just said, is going to be in charge of coordinating all autonomic function. It says what has to be done with the autonomic function. The midbrain is actually what is going to continue that on. So it's kind of like the supervisor. And so here you're going to have the reflex centers. You're going to have the substantia nigra, which makes your dopamine. And if you remember from the neurotransmitters you looked at in the previous lecture slide, dopamine is very important for regulating mood. So your midbrain is very important for the regulation of your moods and emotions as well. You have your cerebral aqueduct with your CSF. So keeping in mind the CSF, or your cerebral spinal fluid, is a fluid that helps protect the brain. And we're going to talk about that in a moment. And then we have masses of gray matter also located here. And those masses of gray matter in the midbrain are called corpora quadrigemina. Okay. The pons, which is going to be the bump. So you have like a little bump that forms here on the brainstem. And that bump is going to be important as a relay station for controlling motor function and breathing. The medulla oblongata, which is the lowest part of the brainstem, is going to be in charge of helping to maintain the regulation of those autonomic functions like blood pressure and breathing and digestion. So that's going to be in charge here in the medulla oblongata. So it's a very important part of the body. And then you have one last part that's important to know within the brainstem, which is your reticular system. This is basically the central core of the brainstem. It's going to be scattered throughout all three previous parts that I mentioned, so in the medulla, the pons, and in the membrane. And it's basically going to be the network of fibers that connect everything together. So you can see that here. So this part here is your pons. From here down to about here is your midbrain, and then all the rest down here is going to be your medulla oblongata. Your medulla oblongata then connects to the spinal cord, which is what will then continue on down through your body. Okay, so how do we protect the brain? The brain is extremely important, and it has to be taken care of. Okay, so both the brain and the spinal cord are going to be taken care of by skin, bone, and then what are known as meninges and cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, so you've got skin, bone, meninges, and the cerebrospinal fluid that are going to protect the brain and the spinal cord. Okay. For the brain, the bone obviously that protects it is going to be your cranial bones. For the spinal cord, the bones that protect it are going to be your vertebral column. Okay. The meninges, you have three meninges that protect the brain. Meninges are nothing but a connective tissue wrapping. It's basically like when you take something and you want to protect it because it's delicate, and you wrap it with a bunch of tissue wrap and then maybe some bubble wrap, and then maybe you put it inside of a box. Okay, that's kind of what you have here. You've got a lot of things to help protect the very delicate brain and spinal cord from damage and injury. And so you have you have skin, then you have bone, then you're going to have the first of the meninges, those connective tissue wrappings, which is called your dura mater. This is the hardest one. So it actually comes off like a thick piece of plastic covering. The arachnoid matter is located right beneath the dura mater, and it's going to connect the dura mater to the pia mater. And in between the arachnoid matter and the pia mater, you're going to have your cerebrospinal fluid flowing through. Okay. Your pia mater is the innermost protective wrapping. It's actually directly touching and covering the brain. So it almost looks like a little very thin layer of cellophane on top of the brain. and on top of the spinal cord. And in this next image, you can see how that looks a little bit. So you're going to have the cranium. So this is bone right here. This is skull. You've got dura mater. Then you're going to have your arachnoid matter. And then you're going to have your pia mater under that. And the cerebrospinal fluid flows through that area. All right. Your cerebrospinal fluid is excruciatingly important in the brain because we can't have direct pathway of blood straight to the brain, because if there's any contamination in the blood, then your brain and your spinal cord are going to be directly contaminated. And so to avoid that, you have something called the cerebrospinal fluid. It's created by astrocytes. So if you remember in the last section, we just talked about those neuroglia, or those glial cells, which are your minions. And the astrocytes is one of those glial cells that actually creates the cerebrospinal fluid for the central nervous system. Okay. And what it does is the cerebrospinal fluid is going to limit your exposure to bloodborne chemicals. It's also going to serve to cushion and protect the central nervous system. The CSF is going to be derived from blood plasma by the choroid plexus in the brain. The cerebrospinal fluid will be replaced about every 8 hours in the body. And as I already mentioned, it's going to create a blockage, hopefully, of pathogens from the blood into the body. If pathogens do enter the brain or the spinal cord, so entering into that cerebrospinal fluid and then causing damage, it can cause inflammation of the meninges. So your meninges being your dura mater, your arachnoid mater, and your pia mater. So if contamination of the cerebrospinal fluid, because it passes through the meninges, can cause swelling of the meninges. Guess what that is called? Meningitis. So meningitis is a infection, bacterial or viral, that causes swelling of the meninges because the cerebrospinal fluid has been contaminated. Okay, and then your ventricles, which are located within your spinal cord and within your brain, these are the cavities through which the cerebrospinal fluid flows. So they're almost like a system of rivers and little tunnels through which that cerebrospinal fluid can flow to bathe the brain. You don't need to know all that much here with regard to the ventricles, but I do want you to know that the cerebral aqueduct is going to connect what is called the third and fourth ventricles, and it's going to be a very large area in which you have a confluence of cerebrospinal fluid reaching. Okay, and you can see here where that cerebral aqueduct is. That's your location, the cerebral aqueduct. While you don't need to know what the third ventricle or where the fourth ventricle is, suffice to know that all of these spaces that you're seeing here, these are the rivers that I just mentioned, the aqueduct system. And so you can see that it's full of cerebrospinal fluid, and it goes passing through all of here to bathe that brain and then goes straight on down into the spinal cord. This is just showing you a section of the choroid plexus. So remembering that the choroid plexus, which is located, which is located, oh, it's not on this image. Oh, well. Well, the choroid plexus, which is formed by the cerebrospinal fluid, or forms the cerebrospinal fluid, I should say. This is what it looks like. So you're going to have the blood vessels running through here. So this is blood vessel with blood running through it. And all of these guys here, these little guys that you see hanging out around here, are those ependymial cells. Remember that I said that the ependymial cells actually form your cerebrospinal fluid? So they're located around the blood vessels so that they can regulate the amount of filtration, or the amount of glucose, water, nutrients, oxygen, etc., that exit from the blood into the cerebrospinal fluid and then regulate how much goes back from the cerebrospinal fluid into the blood. So this is just like an extra layer of protection to avoid contamination, or hopefully avoid contamination. Okay, the spinal cord. So we've already talked about the brain. We talked about what things protect the spinal cord in the brain. And now I just want to briefly talk about the spinal cord. Spinal cord is really important in the autonomic nervous system. We're going to look at this in a lot of detail. So for your spinal cord, you're going to have, your spinal cord, remember, connects from the end of the medulla oblongata all the way down to L1 and L2. And if you remember your bones, L1 and L2 are lumbar vertebra 1 and lumbar vertebra 2. So that means below lumbar vertebra 2, you no longer have spinal cord within the vertebra. Okay. That last region of the vertebral column past L1 and L2 is called the cauda equina. Okay. Your spinal cord will grow from within the womb when the baby is developing all the way through to about 4 years of age. After that, the spinal cord stops growing, even though the vertebral column continues to grow. We're going to look at the spinal nerves when we get into the autonomic nervous system. But suffice to know that from the spinal cord, you're going to have nerves exiting. Okay, and this is what your spinal cord looks like. You can see that beautiful pattern here of the butterfly in dark matter. So if you remember, the brain is dark and then white in the middle. This one is white and dark in the middle. So you can see it here. This is the vertebral column. This here is the bone of the vertebral column. And this is your spinal cord located within it. Okay, so here we're doing a transverse cut so that you can see that. And you can see these meninges that are covering it. So your pia mater is located right up against it, just like in the brain. Then you're going to have a little bit of space with the cerebrospinal fluid flowing through. The arachnoid matter, a little bit of space, and then the dura mater. Okay, so your brain, your anatomy of the spinal cord, I'm not going to go into every little detail here. For lab, do know all these different parts, but it's important to understand that what happens with your spinal cord is you're going to have something called the dorsal root and something called the ventral root. You can also call these anterior root and posterior root. Remember that posterior and dorsal are synonymous with each other and can be used interchangeably. Ventral and anterior can also be used interchangeably. And so what happens is information that is being sent from outside the body will run through, not outside the body necessarily, but that is coming into the central nervous system will come in via the dorsal root. So information entering always goes this way in, whether it comes from the left side or the right side. And then information exiting after being integrated and you're sending out information, it's sent via the ventral root. So your ventral root becomes what is called your efferent root because it's exiting. And your dorsal root is your afferent because it is what is coming in. And we're going to look at that in more detail when we get into the peripheral nervous system. Okay. These are just more images showing you that matter. Please make sure that you're using your lab list to study all parts of the spinal cord and brain that you need to know for your exams. We are done with the central nervous system. You'll receive another recording for your peripheral nervous system. Have a good day.